Hello, and this video is going to be all about money supply. This is a follow-on video from the video I just did on money. You might want to watch that as well before you watch this. But to summarize, in that video we went through how there's two basic human instincts, that of barter or swapping things, and of debt or borrowing things off people. And these two basic instincts constitute the two different kinds of money there are, which is medium of exchange and money of account. And through time, as societies have got more complicated and the size of the economy in different societies has expanded, barter's developed into commodity money, representative money, and then this current situation of fiat money, which is money that's not actually representative of anything of any value. It's essentially just pieces of paper or numbers on a computer screen. Money of account, which is how debt's been recorded initially after the invention of writing on clay tablets by the Babylonians, but then in medieval England and by the Vikings and the Romans using tally sticks, and then after the invention of paper and double entry bookkeeping, the use of ledger books, and then following the invention of computers, money of account is now mostly stored on database ledgers on computers. And I also explored in that video how the blockchain technology described by the Bitcoin white paper is probably going to be the future of how money of account is recorded, as that has loads of advantages over just database ledger entries. However, it's perhaps unlikely that that will be through using Bitcoin. There's also stable coins and CBDCs, which are a way of using this blockchain technology. And an important theme that came out from that video is that most of the money in existence is actually money of account. It's actually arises out of debt. And in the UK, for example, now only 5% of the money supply is cash or notes and coins. The vast majority of the money is money of account, not medium of exchange, and it's stored on the databases of computers. And the creation of much of this money supply arises from debt, from lending money. So, to focus on that, the act of usury or lending money has this amazing magic of being able to create money out of nothing. And that's actually why the Christians and the Muslims believe it's a sin to lend money and create this, do and perform the sin of usury, because obviously they believe that only God can create things. And so the act of creating money out of nothing through usury is a sin to Christians and Muslims. And how usury creates money out of nothing is, if you consider, and let's think of a simple example like a Venetian bank. You start off with the bank deposits, which would back then be actually would actually be commodity money, so silver coins. And but not everyone wants to access their coins at the same time. So the banks naturally started lending money to people. When they lend that money, those people then have to pay back interest. And of course, that debt, that interest on the debt would be show up as money of account, because it's in their ledger book in entries that people owe them money for the money that they've lent out. And also, once they lend out the money, that becomes a ledger book entry as well. And then eventually, over time, the debt gets paid back. But actually, most of the actually a lot of the commodity money, only a fraction of it is stored at the bank branch, and a lot of it is there's a lot of money being lent out to people. But once all the debts are paid back, the situation we have is that we've actually created money because we've got the original loan that's been paid back to the bank plus the interest earned becomes a ledger entry on the balance sheet of the bank. And then as long as everyone doesn't come back at once and ask for their money in physical form, we have this perpetual increase in money in the economy because by lending money and creating this interest, banks are able to create money out of nothing essentially through usury. So this is my way of explaining how lending money is a way of creating money out of nothing and so increasing the money supply. And as I went through the technical details of fiat money and database entries in terms of money of account, we reached the conclusion in my last video that the vast majority of modern money supply is fiat money that has no intrinsic value because only 5% of that money is actual fiat money, as in banknotes, which obviously has no intrinsic value because it's just pieces of paper that can't be exchanged for gold, as was the case previously with representative money. It really is just worthless pieces of paper. And then the other 95% of the money supply is money stored even as bank reserves or as retail deposits and wholesale deposits. And so these are all essentially numbers on the bank's digital ledgers. And so they only have value as much as people trust the bank to pay you that money if you request it. Actually, intrinsically, it kind of doesn't have any value. Of course, what gives fiat money value is that within every within every society, you have a government in control, which has a monopoly on violence. So, by monopoly on violence, anyone living in that country has to pay taxes, and they have to use the legal tender, which is the currency of that government, because everyone within any jurisdiction has to use a legal tender and has to pay taxes. That's actually what gives the fiat money that its value actually. And also what gives it that value is the confidence that people have that the government's going to be able to issue debt in the future by issuing bonds, and also that the government's going to be able to raise taxes in the future. So a particular currency only keeps its value as long as everyone's confident that the government's stable enough that it will be able to continue to raise taxes in the future and keep going. So because the government has a monopoly on violence, all citizens can only transact in its fiat legal tender and have to pay taxes. So here I try to explain how the money supply operates in a modern country. So we have all the citizens and legal entities of a country represented here. And because the government has a monopoly on violence, everyone has to use the legal tender, which is the pound sterling in the case of the UK, and everyone has to pay taxes. That means that the government has a amount of taxes coming in every year. However, the government has to spend money on police, schools, state pensions, and all these kinds of things to keep the people happy so that they don't riot and so that the government doesn't then lose its monopoly on violence. So the problem is, though, is that once you look at the amount that the government spends and then what they receive in taxes, most modern governments are actually running on a fiscal deficit. And in fact, in the case of the UK, that's 121 billion a year or 2% of GDP. These are kind of approximate figures. However, with the current fiat economic system, most modern governments are successfully running a fiscal deficit. In fact, the whole system almost requires them to run a fiscal deficit for it to work. And they're able to run a fiscal deficit because they can make up for the shortfall in money by raising government bonds. And other governments, which have weaker currencies, insurers and pension funds mainly, but also other people, are always willing to buy government bonds whenever they're issued. And they basically supply money then, which the government can use for its to cover its fiscal deficit. And in return for that, these people who buy the bonds get an interest rate, which currently at the 10-year is about 4%. So these things at the top, they're actually more about the recycling of the current money supply than being the much of the actual money supply itself. But these mechanisms here actually underpin the entire fiat system and explain how the current money supply can persist, even though being fiat, the money supply actually has no intrinsic value. Its value is based on people having confidence in the current legal tender of that government and being prepared to buy bonds in that currency. And it does kind of make one realize that the yield curve of a particular currency um, is actually probably one of the most important aspects of the of economics really, and of the finances of a country, even though it's probably the least talked about and least understood really part of investing. It's probably one of the most important factors underpinning everything. So we've explained how the government in a modern democracy has a monopoly on violence. Everyone there has to use their legal tender and pay taxes. They get some compensation for that from spending and running the country, and governments have to raise bonds to cover the deficit. However, in terms of money supply, as we see here for the UK, only 5% of the money supply is actually cash. If you go back in history with more primitive economies, actually most of the money supply then would have been cash in the form of commodity money or kind of gold or silver coins. However, today only a small percentage, in fact 5% of it is. The majority is actually retail deposits and wholesale deposits. And the retail deposits are the bank balances that we all have at our local bank that we use for day-to-day use, plus things like if you borrow money to buy a house, that can be considered retail deposits. The bank creates the money out of thin air, and that loan that you then give to someone, that's how that debt ends up filtering back into the overall retail deposits held by everyone's banks. And the wholesale deposits, that's mainly where banks lend businesses lots of money for new investment. So if you think of utility companies or GlaxoSmithKline or oil companies, most of the big companies, but actually also lots of private businesses and lots of other businesses, they borrow money, and that can be considered, well, the larger numbers there can be considered wholesale deposits. So banks are lending individuals and businesses lots of money, plus you have the balances that have accumulated over time, which are constantly churning between individuals and businesses with all the transactions that go on each day. And that together makes up for actually 75% of the total money supply. And so interestingly, it's not actually the medium of exchange side, it's the money of account side there actually that represents that money supply. And actually, in a way, fiat money is probably you could consider a hybrid of medium of exchange and money of account, because now most of it is actually just numbers on computer screen rather than being an actual medium of exchange itself, or if it is a medium of exchange, it's like a digital medium of exchange. So we see that the two have kind of merged here. So the fact is, though, that the vast majority of the money supply is retail and wholesale deposits, which are essentially just mostly numbers on a computer screen managed by the banks. The banks also lend money to people to buy houses, or to on their credit cards to blow on holidays abroad for their Instagram photos and their Facebook photos, or to borrow money to buy cars. And so that's obviously a way that the banks can make money for themselves, but also all of this lending and debt helps increase the money supply overall, as is of course lending money to businesses. And then the central bank, this is where the banks store their bank reserves. So we see that about 20% of the total money supply is actually the bank reserves. And the banks actually, although that kind of belongs to the banks, they store it at the central bank. And what happens is that the majority of transactions, which happen every day, they get cleared by the banks. So if two individuals have the same bank, then obviously the bank can easily settle that by just jiggling the numbers around on their own database. But if two individuals have different banks, then obviously the banks have to communicate with each other to change the numbers to make sure everything balances using their electronic ledgers. But of course, at the end of every day, there might be imbalances there between the banks. And so what the banks do is the central bank actually makes those adjustments at the end of every day to make up any small differences between the bank's tallies there. And that's what the overnight or interbank lending rate is. And that's the number that's set by the central bank that everyone plays so much importance to. That's basically just the overnight lending rate for when banks have to lend each other money just overnight to reconcile any differences at the end of each business day. So the central bank stores the bank reserves of the commercial banks to facilitate that. And one effect of that is it allows monetary policy, because the Bank of England can change the base rates there, or overnight lending rate, which then changes which then affects the rates at which banks can lend to businesses and lend money for people to buy houses and cars and things, is obviously then impacted by the overnight bank lending rates. And so this is how, through monetary policy, the central banks try to control the economy by speeding it up or slowing it down, depending on where inflation is and where GDP growth is, and also where unemployment is. Now, actually, quantitative easing is another thing that central banks can do, because if they just print money and buy a load of bonds, that then lowers the curve, which means that the governments can lend for a cheaper rate because there's more buyers, because the central banks coming in there and competing with the normal buyers of bonds to help keep the rates down, which is then beneficial for the government who's borrowing the money. So this is the fiat-based banking system that kind of now exists, looked at through the lens of money supply. And really, an overall comment here is it's interesting how, going back through history, we see how money has adapted as economies have got bigger and bigger. It's probably actually not practical to use gold or silver commodity money anymore, or even as representative money using a gold standard anymore. the economies are probably too large and too fast for that to be practical. So the kind of technology has allowed this fiat money system, but it's very interesting that only a small fraction of that is actually cash now. Most of it's money of account, and most of it's just numbers on the bank's computer screens. And it's all pinned together by the government having a monopoly on violence. And really, the confidence overall is on that legal tender. The moment there's a loss of confidence in that legal tender, then the government can't issue bonds cheaply anymore, and the whole society would collapse. And this system requires ever more and more debt and ever more lending of money to really sustain it. And even here, where the government's actually running a fiscal deficit and always issuing more debt, really, in the form of bonds, that's how the world economy works. Here's the UK money supply, and I've already explained what the bank reserves are, what retail and wholesale deposits are, and their compositions. And in terms of the terminology, we used to use the term M0, but now I think we just call it the monetary base. And that's the public money, which is the bank reserves held at the central bank by the banks for overnight lending purposes, and notes and coins in circulation. And then private money is the notes and coins held by the retail banks, but not taken out of the cash machine yet, wholesale bank deposits and retail bank deposits. And here we see how the money, in order for the money supply to keep on increasing, it requires the banks to loan more money to people, to set up new businesses and go on new ventures, and also just to create new money, I guess, through usury, is how the private money supply is expanded. And it's interesting that the actual expansion mainly does seem to come from private money and the activities of interval banks, not perhaps the activities of the government. But the government can encourage the increase of money supply through perhaps quantitative easing and through having lower interest rates, and then I suppose indirectly through inflation, I guess. And then here's the terminology for the US. The US use a slightly different terminology. They rope together the currency in circulation rather than this distinction that we have in the UK. And I wonder if that's perhaps a practicality, because in the case of the US, it's the world's reserve currencies. There's lots of US dollars just floating around in all over the world, being used often in the black market and things like this. And it's considered to be public money. Then the bank reserves in the reserve balances in the US are 13%, and their terminology here, digital savings deposit and money market accounts, which is kind of their version of wholesale money, and digital bank deposits, which is their version of retail money. They account for 11% and 67% of the total US money supply. And so the US, they just use the term monetary base to refer to the notes and coins issued by government and the bank reserves held at the central bank. And then private money is called M1, with reference to the digital bank deposits, which I think is their version of retail, deposits. And M2 is the M1 plus digital saving deposits and retail money market accounts. So this is the overall money supply and its terminologies. And what's fascinating is I've described this system where in order to work the current fiat economic system, it just requires ever more creation of debt and lending of money as the economy gets bigger and bigger. And if you look at the history of M2 in the US, we have this interesting exponential curve where over time, through this system of the money supply getting bigger and bigger as the banks lend more and more money, you get this lovely exponential trend. Now, it kind of did this strange thing following the epidemic in 2020 and all of the crazy government decisions following that and lots of money printing and stuff. But it seems to have actually returned back to normal. Here's that same graph on the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And you see, now we've got a bit more data than when I did that screen print before. I do believe we're getting back on the exponential track here. Following this pandemic craziness, we seem back on this exponential trend, and it just seemed that that how the economic system of money has developed through all of these inventions and this economic system that's become entrenched with all modern societies, of using fiat currencies, it has led to this exponential trend, and it seems that our current financial system relies on this. And of course, one can't help but think of bacteria on a petri dish, and also lots of other population trends in nature. You get this exponential growth phase, followed by, when it just becomes mathematically ridiculous, you then get the death phase. And I can't help but think that when the increase of the money supply just gets ridiculous, that we'll also get a death phase. Now, luckily, although it does look kind of ridiculous already, when you zoom in to only the last 10 years, it actually looks a lot more sensible at this time scale, and only actually is increasing by about $500 billion every year, assuming we go back to this trend. So actually, although the system does sort of seem a bit kind of crazy in that you just have this system of just continuous requirement for ever more debt for the system to be sustained, when you look at it at this time scale, it should go on for another 10 years or so. It should go on for at least a decade or quite a number of decades before mathematically it just becomes too out of control. Then we have to start worrying. But despite how incredulous the numbers kind of look, when you zoom in, we got quite a few decades to go, I think, before something has to break. Of course, this isn't investment advice, and always speak to your financial advisor before making any investment decision. But myself, having looked at the money supply to kind of give me a better understanding for my own investments and stuff, my current base case is that the current financial system requires this exponential increase in money supply that we see, at least that we notice when we go to this time frame, but that we've got, in my opinion, and I speak to your financial advisor, but in my opinion, still got quite a lot longer to go before we enter the death phase. I do videos like this one just for fun as a hobby. It's for entertainment purposes only. Always consult a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decision.